Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Tuesday, April 16th, 2019. We're continuing our Star Wars coverage with some more on Star Wars, The Rise of Skywalker. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief, Peter Sciretta, and joining me at this podcast is Slash Film Managing Editor, Jacob Hall.
Hello, hello.
And Senior Writer, Ben Pearson.
Hey, what's going on?
Not much. So this is our first podcast for the week because we've been over-recording, as I mentioned on the last episode, which was Sunday. Ben, you have been away on a little mini vacation, so you weren't around when we recorded our reaction to Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, the teaser trailer. You actually did not comment on the title or the teaser trailer or anything. So, first of all, when did you get to see this trailer? Were you like in the middle of the woods on your phone?
Yeah, so my wife and I were in Sequoia National Park, and I knew that this trailer was coming on Friday, and I had my computer with me, but the Wi-Fi signal wasn't great. I had my phone with me, obviously, but we made the call that we were going to wait until we got home so we could watch it on the big screen. So that was like, we didn't see the trailer until I think it was Sunday night or something. But it was pretty glorious to watch on a proper screen instead of just my little phone. So my reaction to this teaser, I don't really know what's going on in it. Like, the story elements are so vague. I guess that's typical of a teaser. I don't know what
typical of J.J. Abrams.
Very, very. I think, to me, I don't know if I listened to some of the podcasts that you guys did. I don't know if I've completely caught up yet, but I'm wondering, did you guys talk about that run that Rey does where she leaps backwards, up and over that thing? Like, that seems to me like something that would be in a Fast and Furious movie, not in a Star Wars movie. It kind of broke my brain a little bit. Like, wait a second, what is going on now? Like, what is this crazy gymnastic move that's going on, and slow-mo and the spinning and everything? It didn't strike me as a very Star Wars moment, but everything else not everything else, but most of the other things I really, really enjoyed. I love the look of it. And then the Palpatine thing came at the end, and I was like, my heart just sank. So I did listen to the conversation you guys had, and I think I probably settled somewhere in between all of you, where it's just sort of like, I'll take a wait-and-see approach and see how this whole thing unfolds, and maybe Abrams has found a decent way to incorporate this, but my first reaction is like, oh God, what is happening here?
Ben, I think Ben has it backwards real quick, Peter, and I think that he's incorrect about Star Wars taking on a Fast and Furious tone when it's clear that Dom and the Fast crew are just all Jedi. That's it.
That would explain that, like, amazing leap over the highway in Fast and Furious 6, but
yeah. I'm actually kind of surprised. I knew about this Palpatine thing ahead of time, and I was expecting there to be a more divisive response to this reveal in this teaser trailer. And at least from what I can gather from my Twitter feed, talking to people in my everyday life, and the reactions from Celebration itself, it seems like mostly people are on board, even more so than the Slash Film newsroom, to Palpatine being in the film. So I'm kind of shocked, because I expected some people to be really upset about that. But yeah, so I think it's really going to be, it comes down to the execution of that, and we will talk about that on today's podcast. We're going to talk about a bunch of stories we published on the site. We're going to answer some mailbag, and I'm going to talk about my theory as well. Actually, you didn't tell us, Ben, you didn't tell us, what did you think of the title?
Oh, I'm still working it out. I don't, I listened to what you guys were talking about, how it just sort of feels strange coming out of your mouth, and I do agree with that. I think I like it. I don't know, man. It's a tough one. I think I'm gonna have to wait and see it in context. But The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi, those are just such concise, I don't know, like, for lack of a better word, strong titles. This one I don't think has that same power. And maybe there have just been so many movies over the past decade with the word rise or alluding to a rise that it sort of feels a little diluted to me now. But I feel like once the end credits roll, I'll appreciate it more than I do right now.
Yeah, I think I agree. I will say this. I remember when the Force Awakens title was announced, I was kind of down on that title. I thought it should have a more Star Wars version of that title. That felt more modern and fresh to me than like a Star Wars title. I thought like the Star Wars version of that title should have been like The Awakening of the Force or, something like that. Mm-hmm. But, JJ's always been a very contemporary guy. Entertainment Weekly's Ash Crossan talked to Abrams at Star Wars Celebration. We have the video linked in the article that we'll link in the show notes, but basically she asked him, what does this title mean? Does it mean that Rise of Skywalker? What is going on here? And JJ basically in JJ fashion did not answer the question at all. He says that the title feels like the right title for this movie. I know it's provocative and asks a bunch of questions, but when you see the movie, you'll see how it was intended and what it means. By the flow of the title, this title had a very big responsibility. It had to end... we talked about the movie and the title as a whole. He says that this movie has to not only be the end of 3 movies, but the end of 9 movies. And the idea of incorporating the movies that come before, strangely, is the story of the movie. It's the characters in the film inheriting everything that's come before in previous generations, whether it be the sins of the father or the wisdom that they've acquired. And the question is this new generation up for the task? So now heard that, who do you think the title is referencing? Is it referencing Luke? Is it referencing Kylo? Is it referencing Rey? Or is it referencing all of us as the teaser trailer kind of alludes to?
I like the all of us theory. Jacob, what do you think?
Yeah, I spoke about this already on the last podcast about the title, but especially after hearing what Abrams says here, I genuinely think that it refers to the ethos of what Skywalker means and the idea of what Luke Skywalker represents as opposed to an individual, which would tie closely to Last Jedi's themes. So I think so. If that's the case, then yeah, I'm all for it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that trailer makes a good point. 1,000 generations live in you, but this is your fight. Some very powerful dialogue there. The other thing that Abrams revealed in interviews at Celebration was that George Lucas was actually involved in this movie in some way. He actually sat down with Lucas and before filming Episode 9, and Lucas helped him get to the center of what this ending of this sequel trilogy is, which I'm not sure if that's a good thing or bad thing, depending on your view on Lucas's involvement in the future of this franchise. But, I mean, obviously, interestingly enough, I've been doing a lot of research recently, and one of the things I came to was Lucas's, there was an article on what Lucas had intended when he made A New Hope, what his intention for the 9 Star Wars films were. And recently someone spoke out about Lucas's actual original intentions. And at that time, his original intention was to have Palpatine, or the Emperor at the time, appear only in Episode 9. And until Episode 9, you'd only see him in, holograms and stuff like that. So I'm wondering how Lucas feels now that the Emperor is coming back to close out this franchise, this trilogy and franchise. But we learned a lot from Star Wars Celebration. I know, Ben, you did a huge roundup of bits and pieces that we just weren't able to cover over the weekend. What is some of the more interesting bits that you wrote up?
One of the things was that Daisy Ridley, who is the star of the movie, revealed that the ending of the film changed sort of on the fly during production. She said that a slightly different beat was added, and that it was nice to sort of experience that ending like along with the filmmaker instead of just having a script handed to her and having it be laid out beforehand. So that sounds very much in line with what we know about J.J. Abrams and how he makes movies and how he's constantly sort of tinkering with stuff. And, we know that there were a lot of reshoots done on Force Awakens, for example, that made that movie way better than it probably would have been otherwise. So it's not surprising to hear that the ending of the movie changed. I am curious if we're ever going to find out what the original version was going to be. Maybe somebody will be able to ask Abrams about that, and maybe he'll actually open up about it now that once the movie comes out, now that the saga is done. But yeah, that's one of the things. And then also, Kathleen Kennedy was asked about the return of Palpatine, and she said that his appearance had been in the blueprint for a long time, indicating that this was something that they've been building to maybe even since The Force Awakens. The interviewer asked about, if this had been in the works since Episode 7, and she said it's been in the blueprint for a long time. We had not landed on exactly how we might do that, but yes. And so it was the way she phrased that, it was sort of unclear if she was specifically saying, yes, this has been in the works since Episode 7, or just, yes, we've been thinking about this for a while. And then, but the interviewer followed up and said, but he was always meant to be in Episode 9, and she said yes. So there's something, and maybe, Peter, that's hinting. I know you've expressed dismay in the past about a potential overarching plan for this trilogy. Maybe that sort of hints that there was a little bit of one along the way.
What I think it is, Ben, is I think that J.J. Abrams kind of created a rough outline for what he wanted this sequel trilogy to be. Mm-hmm. And then when they, had other filmmakers, Rian Johnson, come on board, Rian Johnson, saw that outline and, didn't have to adhere to any of it. Not to say that he didn't, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I have a question, though. I think this is actually the question everyone's asking, and the question that I feel like we're all dodging. And I think it's very, very important we ask it at this juncture. But will Episode 9 introduce Constable Zuvio?
You know what?
Man.
Ash Crossan of Entertainment Tonight actually asked J.J. Abrams this at Celebration, and he basically just laughed it off. So,
in other words, yes.
Yes. I hope so, because I think you can only see him in literally one freeze frame of Star Wars The Force Awakens. Like, he's almost impossible to see, and he's in the background, and like he was part of like the entire marketing for that movie, and he had his own figure, which still you can find him on the shelves of your local Target and Walmart. So okay, let's talk about John Boyega. He appeared after the panel. He appeared on the Star Wars show stage, and I was watching that, so I wrote this up for the site because he let a little interesting bit slip while talking to Anthony Carboni of the Star Wars show. He said that the Skywalker saga is done. I felt amazing being part of this final fight. For me, after Episode 8, I wanted more clarity. I had so many questions. I am a Star Wars fan on set that likes to debate everything. So for me, I wanted to see more. I wanted to know more about these characters. I wanted to see them together. So I was like, come on, JJ, man. I haven't written a drop, but I know exactly what the fans want. They want to see everybody together. They want to see the dynamics between Rey and Kylo. They want more explanation of the Jedi path. So let's do it. So I'm glad JJ was on the same exact page. So, I mean, judging by the teaser trailer, we definitely see this main crew together, kind of almost for the first time. We saw them together in that last shot of The Last Jedi, but this is the first time that we're gonna spend some meaningful time with that main crew together. So it sounds like, Boyega got his wish there. But the interesting thing here, I think, is him saying that we're gonna get some clarity. So I think what he's saying there is we're going to finally end the debates completely. Not only, who are Rey's parents, but, who was Snoke? Who is the evil behind the First Order? All those questions that fans still have. And also that we're going to see more explanation of the, the path to being a Jedi, which could be kind of interesting. Jacob, do you have any thoughts on what Boyega teases here?
I like this, and I like the idea of him talking about the path to the Jedi, especially because we see Luke train with Yoda for like 3 days before he runs off and becomes a Jedi Master between movies, more or less, because he goes from being a guy who loses his fight with Darth Vader to being this sort of robe-wearing, Master of the Force in Return of the Jedi. So I would really love if this movie really delves into how Rey becomes powerful and how she becomes able to leap over a TIE fighter like she does in that trailer. I would love the nitty-gritty of that. And I like how Boyega sounds like you, Peter. He sounds like he wants something out of Star Wars, the same things you want out of it. So you reading that, I was like, oh, it sounds like him and Peter would have a great conversation about what would be a good Star Wars movie.
Oh, we totally would. And, you know, that is another one of my disappointments of The Last Jedi, is going into The Last Jedi, I was like, oh, we're going to get more of that. We're going to get to see some Jedi training. We get to see some of that stuff in, like, Star Wars Rebels and Clone Wars. And I feel like that's we get more of that than we actually get it in the actual movies themselves. And, you know, Last Jedi, it wasn't about Luke being, you know, a trainer to Rey, and he taught her a couple lessons, but not much. I'm wondering, you know, in this next film, if I mean, who's going to train Rey? Is it going to be the Force ghost of Luke Skywalker, or it could be Leia?
Maybe
it's Leia.
Maybe it's the Jedi texts. Like, she trains herself just reading the books that she has.
That is going to be riveting viewing, watching her read text, and it's going to be like her, like. It's going to be like me reading my magic books. I read it and I like try to do a double lift with a deck of cards. Okay.
You know, Peter, if they release a book that's a recreation of one of those Jedi texts with like different essays written by the various authors, like this, like tales disguised as legends, disguised as lessons type things, and release it as like a $50 like looking like a worn actual like ancient book, I would buy that book and read it cover to cover.
Yes, Jacob, please, for the love of God, do that, and then you can read from that at the end of every water cooler episode instead of that god-awful joke book.
They do have some kind of Jedi text book. I've never bought it. They have a Sith one as well. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about, you know, we're dancing. Another thing we're dancing around here, Jacob, is not only Constable Zuvio, but we're dancing around the idea that Rey's parents could be changed in this final chapter. Obviously, in the last film, The Last Jedi, we hear Kylo tell Rey that her fears are correct, that her, you know, and she admits to herself that her parents are nobodies, and I guess junkers from Jakku is what is said. JJ was asked if if Rey's parents are going to be changed in this final installment. Ben, what did he say?
Yeah, he was actually asked if we're going to find out who they are. And his response was sort of illuminating. He said, I will say that we knew going into this that this movie, it had to be a satisfying conclusion. And while we were well aware that that's one of the things that's been out there, I don't want to say that what happens in episode 8, and then he essentially means, like, I don't want to say what happens in episode 8 didn't happen. He said, we have honored that, but I will say that there's more to the story than you've seen. So there's a lot to talk about there. This is a whole thing that has been one of the, I would say, like one of the centerpieces around the discussion of The Last Jedi is how that reveal has sort of encapsulated the movie's themes overall, and what that could potentially do to the Star Wars trilogy, or maybe even saga as a whole, if that is undone. But I don't know, Peter. I know you're about to talk about your theories because you wrote this whole thing, and I have to say really quickly that I've been a big supporter of these of the Rey's parents are nobody reveal, and I have been very my heels have been dug in on this point, and I just really don't want there to be any sort of going back on that in any way. But I have to say that taking a step back and sort of looking at this whole thing, especially in light of Abrams' recent comments about how this movie is going to be the resolution of 9 films, and looking at the entire saga on a sort of a macro level, I kind of do think that there is going to be some sort of extra information, some sort of extra reveal here that ultimately makes this universe a little bit smaller than I wanted, than what The Last Jedi seemed to indicate. But also, I just looked back, and I don't know if you guys read this article and that I just published right before we started recording, but I found this interview with Rian Johnson where he was asked right before The Last Jedi came out if Rey's parentage was going to be revealed in the movie, and his response is very, very interesting. We've linked the article in the show notes. I want people to go, if you're interested in this topic
come on,
at all.
You got to tell us what he said.
Okay, so I don't have it actually written out, but he says, let me see here. He says it's something that's absolutely addressed in this movie. And then they said, will there be clarification? And he said, it depends on, and then he stops himself and says, like, I can't actually say anything because I'm going to give it away. But just the fact that he paused there and said, it depends on, I mean, you can fill in the blanks there of like what he was going to say. It depends on whether you believe Rey and Kylo. It depends on whether they're in the proper headspace, whether they're being controlled by somebody, whether they're being incepted by someone. I mean, there are like an infinite number of possibilities there. But just the fact that he wasn't completely steadfast about, yes, it's being revealed in this movie, leads me to believe that he knows that there's some wiggle room there. And I guess that's a good transition into your theories, Peter.
Before I get into my theories, I do want to say something here, because a lot of people take this whole reveal of Rey being from a no one as, you know, in the whole Last Jedi, like, has this message that anybody can be a Jedi. That was always the message that it wasn't always the message. George Lucas had this whole thing about midichlorians, and some people had higher midichlorians than others. I think that's a little bit of bullshit, but there was always Jedi outside of the Skywalker blood. Like, that wasn't something that Rian Johnson brought to this franchise, and I feel like he gets improperly credited with that idea. This was always going to be the Skywalker saga of 9 films. You know, Kathleen Kennedy was saying that when promoting Episode 7. So I don't think that her having some being, if she were to be related to the Skywalkers in some way, like, does a disjustice to this universe. Yes, it makes this universe small, but we're telling the Skywalker saga here. We're not telling the history of the Jedis in the Star Wars universe. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Jacob, do you have any thoughts before I get into my theory?
Ben echoes them quite well already. I will, however, say your theory made me angry because I think it's correct.
Okay. Let me talk about my theory. This came over the weekend. There was a shot in the Star Wars, and I should say that this is a theory. Nothing I'm about to say is anything I know, but potentially this could be how it happens. So if you don't want to speculate on possibilities, then I guess turn off this podcast now. But we're going to do mailbag after this, so hopefully you can stick around. Okay, so there's a shot in the Star Wars, the Rise of Skywalker trailer that shows this ship descending on this kind of like snow-capped mountain like planet, a planet we've never seen in Star Wars history. And it's actually one of the few shots in this trailer that kind of like stands out because it's not like a cool visual, and I don't know, it's kind of weird that it's there. Like, it doesn't seem to serve much of any purpose in the context of the teaser trailer. But someone over the weekend, someone named Genghis, noticed that the ship in this shot actually looks very much like the ship from Star Wars: The Force Awakens. During Rey's Force back sequence, this is when she touches Luke's lightsaber and she starts having this she experiences these events from the past and her past and the past of the the lightsaber. She ends up seeing Luke watching the Jedi Temple burn. She sees the Knights of Ren slaughtering people, and then she even sees visions of her own past. And as you know, there's these she sees this image of a young child herself being held back by Unkar Plutt, and she's yelling, "Come back!" And she looks up at the sky where young her is looking, and there's this ship flying away from Jakku while the young her is screaming. It's very much implied here that whoever left her on Jakku, maybe not necessarily her parents, but whoever left her on Jakku are in that ship. I think we can all agree upon that much. And this is where my theory begins, because there's some interesting things here. There's all during this Force back sequence, you can hear these quotes from people throughout the Star Wars saga. You can hear quotes from Obi-Wan. You can hear quotes from Yoda. You can actually hear a quote from Palpatine. Right before Rey actually sees her parents or whoever left her on Jakku, there's actually a quote from Palpatine that is said at that point. So I'm wondering if this film is gonna explore Rey's parents, if that ship has anything to do, is that the ship of Rey's parents or whoever left her on Jakku? You mentioned that Kathleen Kennedy said that Palpatine was in the works long ago, I think is the quote. And considering Colin Trevorrow was working on this film just a year and a half ago, that does not sound long ago to me. So I'm assuming, like you had assumed earlier in this podcast, that this is probably the plans to bring Palpatine in were probably developed sometime in The Force Awakens. That they had planned on bringing him in. I'm assuming they were planning on bringing him in Episode 8, and that did not happen. But okay, this is where my theory goes into high gear here. As you said, he says there's more to the story of Rey's parents. And there's that scene in The Last Jedi where Kylo Ren tries to convince Rey to join him, and he's under ulterior motivations. He says that she knows the truth, and filthy junk traders who sold her off for drinking money, they're dead in a pauper's grave in the Jakku desert of her parents. But he's saying this under, in this moment, he's trying to get her to join him. I feel like it's the most, it's like the worst unreliable narrator of a moment. So I'm not sure you can trust what he's saying in that moment. And also you can't trust, like, where does he get this information? Is he just relaying what he saw in her mind when he saw her mind and saw her biggest fears? If he saw her biggest fears that she was a daughter of no one, is it because he talked to Snoke and Snoke told him, oh, she's a nobody? That's another another layer of unreliable narration there. But the biggest thing that I was thinking when I was delving into this shot is the idea that her parents were these filthy junk traders on Jakku, who sold her off for drinking money, and they're now dead in a pauper's grave in the Jakku desert. Now, if you look at the ship looks like a nice ship. And whoever left her are leaving Jakku. So why would her parents be, number one, needing to sell her off for some booze money, but they're somehow leaving Jakku in a fancy ship. And number two, they've left Jakku, but Kylo says that they're in a grave in Jakku. Rian Johnson is a very smart filmmaker and screenwriter, and I think he probably watched Force Awakens many times before filming Last Jedi, and he saw that shot. I think there's no mistake there. Like, I don't think he made a mistake in what Kylo is saying. I think that purposely doesn't line up because there's something more sinister at play here. Does everybody? What do you guys think of that part of my theory?
Jacob, what do you think?
I mean, it makes sense. Part of me, I genuinely think that Rian Johnson was doing a hard pivot away from all this, and that Abrams is pivoting back.
But you could easily line that up. You could be like, there were people that are trying to get rid of you, and they left Jakku. Like, why say that they're in a desert grave? Like, that seems to go against the evidence we saw on screen.
I mean, if people, I guess my petty devil's advocate thing would be they're taking the ship to another part of Jakku. They go through another city in Jakku. I mean, there are tiny things they could poke holes in, but it's also
they could be hitchhiking. They could,
I think mostly what you're saying lines up. I mean, I'm not sure if I like it, but I think it lines up. I think it makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, that's kind of where I am too.
Okay, so this is the final thrust of my theory, which you can read the whole thing on slashfilm.com. I'm going over it really fast here. But when Force Awakens came out, I had this theory that I wrote up for the site. What if Rey was the daughter of Supreme Leader Snoke? And I wrote up this theory because in that film, it kind of has a symmetry. That the kind of symmetry that we love from George Lucas in the Star Wars films. Our villain, Kylo Ren, is a Skywalker-blooded son of one of our heroes, Han Solo and General Leia. why not have our new hero, Rey, be one of the offspring of our villains? And also, Kylo is the bad guy in these films, resisting the pull of the light side. He's always in resistance of, deep in his heart, he wants to be good, but he's the bad guy. And Rey is the good guy who keeps on having to resist the pull of the dark side. Like in the Force Awakens, she, like, even in the book adaptation, she's hearing like a voice that's almost like Palpatine in her head, and like she strikes down at Kylo in anger, and she has to stop herself at many points. When she's in Last Jedi, Luke notes that she went right for that, like, that dark hole in the island. Nothing stopped her. So I had theories that she was, the daughter of Snoke. We later learned that Snoke is an alien being, so that wouldn't make much sense since Rey is a human being. So now I'm wondering, is it possible that Rey is a Palpatine? That Rey's lineage is not a Skywalker, not a Obi-Wan Kenobi, not any of these good Jedi that we know. That she actually has a line in the bad, and we don't know how Palpatine's going to show up in this film. I think it's going to be more than a Force ghost, but we do know in the comic books there's this panel, and Ben, I think you wrote this up for the site, am I correct?
I think so.
Yeah. There's a panel in a recent comic book that kind of suggested that Palpatine kind of impregnated Anakin's mother, because Anakin had a virgin birth on Tatooine, and they've been doing a lot with Palpatine in the comics, actually. They've been showing what he actually put in plans to kind of start the First Order after his death. He was actually kind of responsible for some of that, and he was also searching for immortality. He says that with Anakin in Revenge of the Sith. So anyways, so if he can create a birth from afar, maybe Rey is, number one, yes, she was born to some random nobodies, so that is still true. And what JJ said in that quote that you mentioned, Ben, that he's not, retconning.
Yeah, he's honoring what happened in The Last Jedi, but there is more to the story. That it fits.
And there's a couple other bits here I want to mention really quick. Rey's lightsaber fighting style is most similar to Palpatine in her, like, jabs and stuff. She's going more out of anger than Luke or Obi-Wan or any of the other Jedis. And the name Rey is a girl's name in Spanish, of Spanish origin, meaning king, which when Force Awakens came out, many thought that that meant that she was going to be related to, royalty like Leia or Ghana, but maybe that means that she's actually related to, the Emperor himself. So this, I guess, would technically make her a Skywalker in some way, because the Palpatine, I guess, in this theory, created Anakin. So she would also be. I think either way, we're going to see her adopt the Skywalker name at the end of this movie. You gotta do that to make this a cohesive whole. So Ben, now that you've heard my theory in whole, what do you think?
I guess I like you had lay out a very compelling case for it, Peter. I kind of hate it, but I also think that it makes a lot of sense. I am wondering, like, if the Emperor has been, God knows where he's been for the past 30 years or however long it's been. But, like, if he has the ability to create life willy-nilly, why isn't he just creating a whole army of people that he could, to give himself better odds of creating a person that he could easily manipulate or something? Like, Rey has proven to be a heroic figure thus far, and there's the chance, the probability that she's going to continue to resist whatever pull he and the dark side of the Force has over her. So, like, if he can just, float above everyone, impregnating random women on various planets, it just seems like, why isn't there, why aren't there hundreds of Palpatine-created people, wandering the galaxy?
I'm assuming in doing so, you're deteriorating your own life in some way to create life. I'm guessing.
Yeah, it could be, and that could be very easily explained with like one line of dialogue, and maybe that would wipe out my entire counter argument there. But Jacob, what do you think? Any additional thoughts here?
As a fan of The Last Jedi, I'm like,
right.
As a Star Wars fan, I'm like, okay. Because Peter's right. The comics have been leaning very, very heavily, or hinting heavily, on Palpatine having been the source of Anakin to begin with. And if, let's say there's a once-in-a-generation chance of finding someone who can give birth to a chosen one or somebody like this, and Rey is that person. And Anakin Skywalker himself was born nobody. He was born into slavery, and he had to be, taken off of a desert wasteland. So, like George Lucas enjoys, it rhymes. George Lucas loves his poetic, rhyming, symmetrical stuff. It makes a lot of sense, and it feels like it could be a proper conclusion for a 9-film saga. I don't like it as a sequel to Last Jedi, but I can be on board it for a final Skywalker film. So, like I said, I'm not so sure if Lucasfilm's fully prepared to... I mean, they say the comics and books are canon, but that's usually just lip service, for people who, really want to dive into that. So if they want to introduce a concept that's that deeply ingrained into the new canon from, other sources, there's a lot of legwork they got to get into Rise of Skywalker. So... But I think Peter's logic makes sense, and I think there's something to be said about Rey being Anakin 2.0 and being Anakin getting a chance, the idea of Anakin getting a chance to be done right as opposed to being corrupted. So it makes sense. I'm half on board and half opposed. We'll see.
It's also, if you think about it, like, without Palpatine, without a big bad, there's no way for redemption for Kylo Ren, right?
He doesn't need redemption. I'm sorry. This is my sticking point. Let that guy burn. He killed his father. He took over the First Order for his own selfish purposes. He needs to go down. He needs to die.
But Darth Vader killed millions and millions and millions of people.
So did Kylo. Or I guess we haven't seen that. But
Darth Vader killed millions of people as a slave. As somebody who felt he had no option, somebody who could control his entire life. Yeah. Kylo Ren made his decisions of genocide as a person born with options who made the active choice and actively pursued this, as opposed to Darth Vader, who could be argued was corrupted from the very beginning. So I feel like Kylo Ren needs to go down, man. He needs to burn. He needs to be put to death with no forgiveness.
Okay, we have a couple questions to answer in the mailbag. I know we're already going over our time slot, but I feel like if we don't get to these now, we won't get to them. So let's dive in pretty quickly. Tal Meridian writes in, am I the only one who saw the opening scene with Rey as some sort of training exercise? There's just a feeling or look that indicates that she is trying something new and testing herself. And I wanted to ask you guys, what do you think? That scene in the desert where the TIE fighter's coming at her, and we know that TIE fighter is Kylo's TIE fighter, but it is curious that TIE fighter is not firing at her. Do you know what I mean? While it approaches, it's not firing, laser blasts at her. So,
go ahead, Peter.
So could it be someone else that we don't know behind the control of the TIE fighter? Is this a training exercise?
I definitely think that's Kylo piloting, and why he's firing, it's more dramatic to try to run her down. He wants to fight. I don't know. But I think that Tom Meridian may be onto something here, because this feels like very much the way she's like waiting and like getting into the moment before she like started running the leap. Makes you wonder if this is going to be a payoff to another scene. Like early in the movie, we see her attempting a similar leap while training, only to fail. And maybe Leia gives her some advice. It's like, oh, we'll try it later. Now she's on an adventure and she has to try it for real. So I'm wondering if they're onto something here with it being a payoff to training. I just don't think it's training itself.
Okay, D-Clan writes in from Toronto, and he writes in with basically explaining how Palpatine could return. He says, remember Darth Sidious, the Emperor, was the apprentice to Darth Plagueis. This is explained in Revenge of the Sith. A Sith Lord that was so powerful and knowledgeable in the dark side that he could influence midichlorians to create life and keep people from dying. In the expanded universe, Darth Sidious learned all of Darth Plagueis' powers when he had nothing left, and learned he killed Plagueis, as was the way of the rule of two. In canon, you recall in Revenge of the Sith, the scene where Palpatine told Anakin about the story of Darth Plagueis and his power. So it's not too far-fetched to consider that the Emperor used the power to save himself at the end of Return of the Jedi. Just a thought. P.S. Sorry, Chris. I have a feeling this will not make you feel any better about the movie. So what do you guys think of that? Like, I think he's dead on here. I think this is exactly how it's going to be explained in the movie of how Palpatine is alive.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And, speaking to what Jacob was talking about with like the groundwork that has to be laid for that, I'm just sort of dreading the exposition that's going to happen if all of this shakes out, just because it just feels so, it's fine when we're like sitting back and talking about it as like conceptual ideas, but when you translate this conversation into movie dialogue, it just, I can't, I don't know, I can't fathom
I think it's easy.
Sounding good.
I think you could like look at Luke's journals as like, that Rey has, and you just feel like, oh, Luke thinks he found evidence that Palpatine could still be alive using some kind of ancient Sith techniques. Like, I guess that maybe is clunky. I don't know. Okay, Cade L writes in. He has a few things here. He says he wonders if the planet in the trailer with the Death Star could be Yavin and could actually be the Death Star from the original Star Wars, A New Hope. Jacob, do you have any response to that?
Could be. I don't know. I guess we've always assumed Return of the Jedi, but I don't know. I do not know the difference between the Death Stars well enough when they're in pieces for me to have an opinion yet. But you know what? You could be right.
I do feel like with the laugh of the Emperor, we know the Emperor in his throne room and Death Star 2. I feel like it's a callback to that. So, he also asked about Endor. Is Endor the moon or the planet? He just rewatched Return of the Jedi again, and I'm pretty sure Vader and the Emperor referred to it as planet, where the shield generator is. I've done a bunch of research on this. The planet of Endor is apparently a gas planet, so it's not actually a planet. It's just a bunch of gas, and they refer to Endor throughout the movie as the forest moon of Endor. So I'm assuming Endor has a bunch of different moons. The one we see with the Ewoks is the forest moon of Endor. Maybe the one here is not the same Endor we saw in that. Maybe this is the grass moon of Endor or something. I don't know. Okay, third question he has: is Palpatine a Force ghost, and would that negate the moral tale within Revenge of the Sith? The film seems to indicate that the dark side cannot produce immortality, but can only prolong physical life, ugly, hateful, sickly life. Whereas Qui-Gon discovers that there is immortality with the light side through the ghosthood. I think that is an important thematic idea, as it further cements the tragic irony of Anakin's turn in seeking immortality for those he loves through the dark side. He brings them death, whereas letting go of life and turning to the light side, one can achieve an immortality within the Force. Assuming JJ cares about this distinction, I would assume Palpatine is alive physically in Episode 9. Any thoughts?
A good thought. I think that the idea of clinging on to life no matter what, despite the circumstances, is something, that can be portrayed as an ugly disease thing, in the context of the Star Wars universe and we're discussing here, whereas letting go of himself, become one with the Force is, as we see in the movies, very much an idea of a very Eastern philosophy thing. And as we know, Star Wars is heavily influenced by a lot of Eastern philosophy. So yeah, I think this is a good observation. Yeah,
and also,
maybe he's just hanging out in like an iron lung in the burned out wreckage of the Death Star or something. He's like he's alive, but he can barely move or something. I don't know.
I think also the search for immortality is driven by fear, right? And if you've heard Master Yoda speak about fear, then you know where that lies. Okay, number 4. All in all, it would have been very nice to have very little original trilogy throwbacks in this new trilogy. As it is, Rey, Finn, and company are not going to be given their own story. Their trilogy ends as their story is really beginning. Having the original characters play so prominently in the new story does a disservice to the new characters. Anyways, Abrams and Kennedy were not brave enough to do this trilogy without massive fan service. JJ tends to do that anyways. Look at Into Darkness. Oh well, I look forward to Palpatine anyways.
First of all, Kate, I will never look at Into Darkness again. That's J.J. Abrams' worst movie by far. But otherwise, it's something that I've been bothered about too, which is that this is the end of the Skywalker saga, but I'm worried it will draw focus away from Rey and Finn and Poe, characters who I genuinely have grown to love over these past two movies. Ben, what do you think?
Yeah, I also think, this is emblematic of Disney's larger approach to the Star Wars saga. Look at, Rogue One and the decisions that they've made with Solo and greenlighting movies based on characters that, fans recognize instead of what they're finally coming around to doing now, which is spreading things out throughout the galaxy and telling new stories that actually further the mythos and, aren't clinging to these older characters. But I will say that the idea of Rey and Finn and Poe and everybody hanging out and being together in this movie is appealing to me, because I love seeing them together, or at least the configurations of them that we saw in The Force Awakens. That was especially Rey and Finn. I love that relationship, and I was sad to see them separated in The Last Jedi, even though I love that movie and I still think it's the best Star Wars movie. But I really am excited about the potential of all of them going on an adventure together instead of being split up. So yes, I do agree with the larger point that I wish these new characters had more of the focus of the story. But I feel like that's, they sort of, because it's the Skywalker saga, they had to include those legacy characters. And then Kennedy has said in the past that, just because the Skywalker saga is over doesn't mean that we're not going to get more stories with Rey and Finn and BB-8 and all of those characters. So I feel like maybe there's room for them still to come back in another trilogy or some sort of continuation or separate story where maybe we could concentrate just on them.
Yeah, I agree with everything you guys are saying. I will say this: reading this email, he makes it sound like this whole movie is mostly about the older, original trilogy characters, and it's all about throwbacks to the previous films. And I would venture to say, if you took all the screen time from anybody from the original trilogy and you added it up, it probably doesn't equal even 20 minutes, right? It's not like they're on screen that much. It is about this new group of characters. It is about, what JJ said. It's about generations inheriting the good and the bad of, what came before them. And I think that is just, Ben, your heritage is just as much about you as the life you lead. Do you know what I mean? I feel like it's about that. And I also don't think, I don't know, everybody, I know Chris was so down on this Death Star thing, but I feel like if you're going to bring the saga to a conclusion, that's a place to end the story, is where it began. I feel like it's so symmetrical in the way that George Lucas loved. I'm not a fan of the forced in, nostalgia moments when Finn was rattling around the Millennium Falcon in Force Awakens. That stuff doesn't work. But if this is part of the grand story and the arc to these characters, I don't see it as fan service. I don't see it as a disservice to these characters. I see it as, this is the end of the story, and it's their adventure, and it just so happens to involve this thing that bookends this franchise.
Yeah, I don't want to entirely speak for Chris, but I'm very much in line with his thoughts of the entire trilogy looking like almost a circle, right? And The Last Jedi doing this really interesting thing where it sort of branches away from the circle. You think it's going to connect all the way back around in this very Lucas-esque way, and The Last Jedi purposefully does a huge swerve away from that. And JJ taking the approach, he could have continued down the path that Rian Johnson took it, but it wouldn't have, it wouldn't necessarily have been a satisfying arc, from beginning to end. Yeah, exactly. So the fact that JJ is taking this path means that he is just taking the squiggle from The Last Jedi and then forcing that circle to be connected. And I am like Chris, where I part of me really, really wants to see where that squiggle would have gone instead of watching the circle be completed. But I guess that's just the approach, and maybe we'll get that type of storytelling elsewhere.
I don't know. We're all speculating right now. I don't think it's going to be as obvious of like a complete 180 turn away from where Rian Johnson was going, but maybe I'm wrong. We'll have to see. Okay, that brings us to the end of today's Slash Film Daily. You can find more of all of our work at slashfilm.com. I'll link all the things we mentioned on today's podcast in the show notes. Please read my theory. It's called "Is This Spaceship the Key to Unlocking the Biggest Secret of Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker?" I will link that in the show notes as well. There's a lot more that I did not get into. A lot of theorizing of what this last film is going to be about there. This podcast, Slash Film Daily, is published every weekday on iTunes, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. Please feel free to send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns to us at peter@slashfilm.com. And please rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends, spread the word, and we'll see you tomorrow.
We ran long, but I think it's worth mentioning, at least in conversation here, that when the Disney Imagineers sent in their original designs for what would become Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, apparently Bob Iger rejected them because his whole thing was, I spent billions of dollars on Lucasfilm, and you're building a park around 30-year-old characters. Build it around the new guys who are actually investing in, which is why Galaxy's Edge is built around the First Order and Kylo Ren and all of the current stuff. So I feel like even though we discussed the idea of this, closing off, the universe for the new guys, Bob Iger and people who are investing the money are very much aware that the future of Star Wars is with these new guys who people will be coming to go visit at Disney World and Disneyland for decades to come. So I think it's at least worth us considering that. Yeah, I'd never heard that before.
And I also think Ben's right. He brought up that interview with Kathleen Kennedy, that her saying that, Rey and Finn and these guys, their adventure's not over here. I think it's just going to be, next time we see them, it's not going to be the Skywalker saga, and it's going to be their complete story to tell.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so.